Before we begin, take a moment wherever you are and ask yourself, what time is it right now? Not just by the clock, but by how you feel. Is it evening with the world quieting around you? Is it midnight when the roads have stilled and the only sound is your own breath? Or perhaps it's early morning with the first light just brushing the edge of your room. Wherever you are, whatever hour you've arrived, I want to welcome you here, to a slower place, to a gentler time. Let me ask you something else. Where are you watching from? Quiet apartment in the city? A warm bed tucked beneath blankets? A room filled with soft sounds? Maybe headphones in? Eyes already growing heavy? Wherever you are, whoever you are, you're safe now. You've made it through another day. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a memory older than any book. A rhythm deeper than sleep. Tale not of heroes or kings, but of one woman, quiet, unseen, carrying the entire future inside her womb. Tonight, we travel back in time, not to castles or battles, but to a small wooden cottage, where a candle flickers in the dark and a woman places her hands gently on her belly. The world outside is cold, uncertain, and cruel, but inside, something is growing. Something warm. Something alive. This is the story of what it was like to be pregnant in medieval times. But really, it's about more than that. It's about the strength that never made it into history books. The kind of strength that breathes, and cries, and carries life forward even when no one is watching. So breathe in, and let's begin. It began with a stillness, not in the world, but within her. A subtle change, something she could not name, nor explain to anyone without sounding mad. The village beyond the hedgerows, the days marched on as always. Blacksmith hammers rang down in bursts, roosters crowed before the sun had properly risen, and the baker's chimney gave off the usual sweet scent of barley and wood smoke. But inside the narrow timber-framed cottage nestled at the end of the muddy lane, something had shifted. The woman sat beside the hearth, pressing her hand lightly against her abdomen. Sensing nothing but the usual aches of the day, she had been late, though her monthly bleeding, once so regular, had simply not arrived. There were no tools to measure this, no doctors to assure her with sterile gloves or tests in vials. It was a feeling passed from mother to daughter, whispered by old wives beside the fire, marked only by a woman's own attentiveness to her flesh. She had carried the firewood more slowly this past week, not from laziness, but from a curious fatigue. The nausea in the mornings, brief but insistent, had grown familiar, and the usual salted herring suddenly turned her stomach in full revolt. Still, she said nothing aloud. In medieval times, to speak of such things too soon was seen as reckless, even dangerous. It could invite misfortune. Best to carry the suspicion quietly, as women had done for generations. Outside, the wind swept. Low over the fields, brushing over barley and oats, tugging at the linen drying on the lines. In the village, people believed that such winds carried spirits, old folk who hadn't found peace, or demons drawn to new life. That was why the women tied bits of cloth to their windows and murmured prayers as they stirred their soup. The woman, though just a peasant's wife, had her own tiny protections. A sprig of rosemary tied with red thread above the hearth. A piece of iron hung near the bedpost, and a small wooden cross hidden beneath her mattress, not for show, but for her own quiet assurance. Her husband, a cooper, who shaped barrels for the manor and abbey alike, had not yet noticed her change in appetite, nor the way she paused to breathe after short walks. He was kind, in the simple, brutish way of men who spent their lives among tools and fire. She wondered how she might tell him, and when, but still, she said nothing. In noble households, things were different. The signs of early pregnancy were cause for quiet rejoicing, especially if the woman was young and the marriage new. Physicians trained in Galenic theory might examine the urine in a brass cup, noting its clarity, scent, or even placing a needle within to see if it would rust, a supposed sign of fertility. Midwives, too, were consulted early in noble households, though they kept to their own lore, trusting dreams, astrology, and intuition. Noble women would be encouraged to rest often, to avoid heavy foods, to stay indoors when the moon was full, for it was believed that the moon's pull could disturb the womb. Peasant women, by contrast, had no such luxury. The woman continued to scrub laundry in the stream, her fingers red from the cold. She bent over to pull weeds from the small garden and helped her neighbor salt pork for winter stores. All while, a delicate life was beginning to form inside her, as silent as candlelight in a monastery. The church bells rang out 3 times a day, calling the faithful to prayer, and she joined in, whispering her Ave Marias and Pater Nosters while cupping her belly with quiet hope. For in these times, pregnancy was not merely a personal matter, it was deeply spiritual. Life was a gift, and the creation of it came wrapped in both awe and fear. Every life was shaped by God's will, and yet still vulnerable to the devil's play. It was common to see pregnant women carrying charms sewn into their bodices, bits of scripture, dried flowers, saints' medallions. Some carried pieces of parchment with Latin blessings written by monks, or little bags of powdered herbs prepared by midwives. She didn't have access to such finery, but she remembered her mother's ways. Boiled nettle tea to strengthen the blood-warm compresses of chamomile to soothe nausea, and a lullaby of ancient prayers whispered at the threshold of sleep. The changes grew more obvious in the following weeks. Her belly began to firm slightly under her dress. Her breasts ached with a fullness she remembered from the time she had nursed her first. A son who had not survived past infancy, she began to crave strange things, not food so much, but smells. Freshly turned earth, rosemary smoke, beeswax candles. Her dreams became vivid, almost fevered, animals speaking to her in riddles. Lost children calling her from the forest, her grandmother brushing her hair by moonlight and saying simply, "It will be different this time." Dreams in medieval thinking were often prophetic. She told no one, but she began to believe the child was a girl at the market. The other women watched her with careful eyes. Some smiled knowingly, others said nothing. Among villagers, pregnancy was often recognized in the tilt of a woman's walk, the sudden softness of her voice, or the way she held her hands near her middle without thinking. A woman near the well offered her marigold petals pressed into her palm with the advice, "Steep them in warm water and drink when the stomach turns." Another told her to avoid looking at beggars or hunchbacks, for fear the child would be born, marked a common superstition in a world where deformities were poorly understood. She thanked them politely, grateful, and wary, all at once. Advice flowed like river water, sometimes helpful, sometimes strange. A neighbor warned her not to sew during certain phases of the moon, or else the child might be born with a twisted limb. Another urged her to avoid touching cats. Some of it she took to heart, some she quietly discarded. At night by the fire she began to prepare. Her fingers stitched linen slowly into soft little cloths, squares for wrapping and cleaning, plain but lovingly made. There was no nursery, no carved cradle waiting in a painted room, but she placed a basket by the bed, filled with fresh straw and lined with wool. And she set aside a thick sheepskin blanket, a gift from her sister last Christmas. She whispered hopes into the weave of every cloth she stitched. "Let her be healthy. Let her live. Let me live through it." For it was no secret that childbirth was as feared as it was revered. Every woman in the village knew someone who had died bringing life into the world. There were no hospitals, only the midwife experienced, but not infallible, in prayer. Sometimes women screamed through the night, their voices ringing out from thatched cottages into the dark fields. Sometimes there was silence, too much silence, and the priest would come in the morning. But still, life continued. The seasons edged forward. The green of spring gave way to summer's haze, and her belly swelled like a rising moon. Her husband finally noticed and nodded solemnly when she told him. He kissed her forehead without a word and brought home an extra wedge of cheese from the manor kitchen. That was his way. The church women gave her gentle tasks, peeling root vegetables, spinning wool, keeping children company, and the priest offered a blessing over her head one morning after Mass. Touching her hair with fingers marked by ash, she cried afterward, not from sorrow, but from the rare feeling of being seen. In the privacy of her room, she lit 2 beeswax candles and whispered her own prayer, improvised from memory and instinct. She asked for strength, for endurance, for a safe passage through the blood and the pain. She asked to be held, if not by another, then at least by something greater. And though the world was full of hardship, of damp walls and aching backs, of heavy skies and uncertainty, she felt for a moment the strange and sacred calm of a beginning. The days lengthened, and the light grew heavy. Sun hung long in the sky, like a brass plate set upon blue linen. Fields shimmered with wheat and barley, and the hedgerows were thick with bees. She moved more slowly now, not out of laziness, but necessity. Her belly, once a hidden whisper of change, had blossomed into fullness. It pressed outward beneath her linen smock, straining the seams of her rough-spun gown. When she walked through the village, she no longer hid it. Nor did she need to. It was obvious in the arc of her spine, the waddle of her step, the way she would pause, hand pressed gently to her lower back. People smiled at her differently now, some with kindness, others with pity, all with familiarity. For in a world where medicine had limits and death was close, pregnancy was not new. But it was always a miracle, always a gamble. By midsummer, the symptoms had changed. The early queasiness had faded, replaced by hunger, sharp and sudden, often strange. One morning she craved bread dipped in vinegar. Another day she wanted dried plums boiled into mush. She ate often, slowly, and with deep appreciation, though she sometimes dreamed of meat her household couldn't afford. She drank warm goat's milk with honey when her stomach twisted, and chewed fennel seeds for the constant taste in her mouth. The village midwife gave her a packet of dried herbs, raspberry leaf, mint, and elderflower, and told her to steep it into tea once a day. She did so dutifully, even though the flavor made her wince. The midwife said it would strengthen the womb and ease the birth to come. No one knew if it worked, but tradition held its own power. And in a world without hospitals, you clung to what the hands of women had passed down. The baby began to move in earnest. It started as a flutter, soft like moth wings trapped under skin, and soon grew into rolls, jabs, hiccups. At night, lying on her side, she would place both hands on her stomach and wait. A kick near the ribs, a stretch across the side. She would whisper to the child nonsense phrases and half prayers. No one had taught her to do this. It simply felt right. The villagers called it the quickening, the moment when the soul had entered the child, when it had truly become a living thing. Many believed it marked the moment when the mother's responsibility to protect it doubled. When God had fully formed it inside her, there was no science to explain it. It's only instinct, and the thundering clarity of a living body speaking from within. Work did not stop, of course. She still fetched water from the well, carried baskets of washed laundry, stirred heavy pots with swollen fingers. But the women of the village began to shield her from the heaviest labor. The baker's wife began sending over crust ends and leftover stew without asking for trade. Her younger sister helped wash the linen. Children were sent to gather firewood. On her behalf, it wasn't charity, it was custom. All women took turns caring for one another in pregnancy because every woman might be next. And in a world where midwives replaced doctors and prayers stood in for anesthesia, the community of women was the only lifeline. In noble homes, summer brought its own rituals. Pregnant noble women would be moved to cooler chambers, often upstairs near large open windows, draped with dampened cloth to catch breezes. Servants would bring trays of broth, pears stewed in honey, or lemon, if the household could afford it. Physicians checked pulses, read urine, and murmured Latin diagnoses. Herbal concoctions were mixed in silver goblets and prayers were said at private chapels. Still, beneath the luxury, the fear remained. No matter how rich the bedding or how ornate the cradle, childbirth remained the same brutal passage between breath and blood, its hope and silence. The peasant woman sat in the shade of her cottage doorway, stitching a tiny cap from scraps of wool. Her feet ached and had begun to swell, so she sat with them propped up on a low stool, cool cloths resting across her ankles. She hummed old songs, half remembered from her own childhood. It was a rhythm her body remembered, though she had given birth before. It felt new each time. The last child had not survived past the first frost. It was a memory she rarely spoke of, but carried in the tightness behind her eyes whenever the baby kicked. This time, she told herself, would be different. She kept the cross under her pillow and added a small blue ribbon to her bedside shelf, a token. She had been told to keep evil spirits away. In town, midsummer celebrations brought music and fire. Young men danced with garlands on their heads, and women jumped over flames with laughter on their lips. She did not join, but she watched from the edge, her hand resting on the small of her back. Someone offered her a sweet bun. She smiled and accepted. Others touched her belly and made playful guesses about the child's gender. It's high, must be a boy. No, see how it's round. Surely a girl. She nodded politely. Amused? These guesses were as old as time, passed through generations and rarely right. But they connected people, one mother to another, one hope to the next. She dreamed more deeply now. Strange, vivid dreams filled with water, music, and light. When one, she was walking barefoot through a field of white flowers, the baby in her arms, though she'd never seen its face. In another, she was underwater, holding her breath as something passed beside her, huge and unseen. The midwife said dreams came stronger in the second stage, when the womb had grown full and the veil between worlds was thin. In their stories, babies still remembered heaven. They kicked and stirred in the night as they prepared to forget. Some believed unborn children could sense the world outside the moon, the mother's voice, even sorrow. So the woman tried not to cry even when the cramps came or her hips ached. She smiled more than she wanted to, hoping the child would feel only peace. Her husband built a new cradle from scraps of oak he had saved from the cooperage. It was simple, unpainted, without carvings, but strong. The smooth wood, and imagined a swaddled baby inside, its cheeks pink from the firelight. The cradle sat near the hearth, beside a stack of fresh straw, wool scraps, and dried lavender tied in little bundles. She added dried chamomile for calm, sage for protection, and fennel to keep evil away. Every village had its rituals. Some women buried knives under the bed to ward off spirits. Others hung hawthorn branches in the window, some whispered charms. At the doorstep before going to sleep, hers were gentler, quieter, rooted in her mother's habits, which had survived through famine and plague. The midwife visited more often now, sometimes in silence, sometimes with gentle questions. She felt the curve of the belly, watched the woman walk, listened to the heartbeat through a long wooden tube pressed to the belly like a sacred horn. She nodded to herself, occasionally muttering Latin. Then she handed the woman a small pouch of dried herbs. Keep this close, she said. When the time comes, burn the bundle and breathe deeply. The midwife was old, but agile, with hands worn smooth from decades of birthing babies in the dark. She knew the rhythms of pain and breath, of fear and hope, and when she placed her hand on the woman's shoulder, it felt like the safest thing. In the world, the heat of late summer arrived suddenly. The nights were hot and sleep came slowly. The woman slept with a damp cloth across her chest and a small bowl of water beside the bed. She woke often to pee, to drink, to shift the ache in her hips. The child moved constantly, dancing under her ribs like a small animal caught in a pouch. Sometimes she laughed aloud from the strangeness of it. Other times she cried softly, not knowing why. Emotions came like waves, joy, sorrow, dread, longing, all jumbled together. Like the scattered dreams that drifted through her on the edge of sleep, and always there was waiting. Waiting for the next sign, waiting for the pain to start, waiting for the world to shift again, the way it had in the quiet first days. She was no longer only herself. Her body was a vessel. Her life had narrowed to one goal: to bring this child safely into the world. And though she moved through her days with purpose, baking, mending, boiling tea, folding cloth, she lived inside the waiting. Like a lullaby stretched long across the fields, the candle she lit each night grew smaller. The days passed slowly. But the child grew stronger, and in her belly, she felt the future kicking toward the light. The wind began to change. It whispered through the thatched rooftops in a new voice, cooler and thinner, as if the summer had exhaled its last and the edge of autumn had arrived to take its place. The woman felt it in her bones before she felt it in the air, the slow tilt of the world toward the next chapter. Her belly had grown heavy beyond comfort now, hard as a bread loaf before baking. Low and forward, pulling at her spine, making every movement careful, deliberate. The simple act of standing took effort. Walking had become a slow shuffle, hips grinding like mill wheels, and the weight of her child pushed down into her pelvis with every step. Demanding space that no longer existed, her breath came shorter. Her sleep came in patches. Her thoughts, once soft and wondering, had turned serious, even somber. She knew the time was close. She feared it. There was no clock to measure her trimesters, no date to circle in a ledger. There were only signs. The way her feet stayed swollen after a night's rest. The fullness of her breasts, the deep ache in her lower back, and the pattern of the baby's movements faster, then slower, then heavy, as if the child were settling. In for its own long journey, some said that when a mother's face grew pale and drawn, it meant the baby had turned downward, preparing for labor. Others said a sudden burst of energy, the urge to clean or gather firewood, meant the body knew what the mind did not. She felt both. The fatigue of endless waiting, and the strange compulsion to sweep the floor over and over, to wash the linens again, to pluck and sort herbs she might not use. It was a nesting, though no one in the village called it that. It was instinct. A creature preparing its den for a storm. The midwife visited more often now. She moved quietly through the cottage, checking the supplies the woman had prepared: clean cloths, fresh straw, beeswax candles, herbs for the afterbirth, a bowl for warm water. She muttered approval at the cradle, touched the woman's wrist with 2 fingers, and pressed gently against her belly. Soon, she said simply. And then, as if remembering something deeper, she reached into her satchel and handed the woman a carved wooden token, a figure of St. Margaret, protector of women in childbirth. "Keep it near," she said. "Pray if you must." In her stories, St. Margaret had been swallowed by a dragon and cut her way free with a cross. A strange, bloody myth, but one that gave women courage. To bear life was to enter the dragon's mouth and hope to come out breathing. The woman wore the token around her neck. It was smooth from use, passed down through many hands. She held it often, not because she trusted saints more than her own body, but because it gave her something to cling to in the tides of waiting. The village priest visited one evening, offering a small blessing. He said little, only that she should confess her sins soon, just in case. She nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. It was not sin she feared, but silence. The silence that sometimes followed labor. The silence when a baby did not cry. The silence when no one said, "She's going to be fine." She had heard it before, in other houses, through thin walls, in early morning hours when birds were still quiet and even. The cows seemed to know. In noble households, the approach of labor brought ceremony. Pregnant women were churched, blessed, and secluded in special rooms known as lying-in chambers. Their windows covered in heavy fabric, the door marked with holy water and herbs. They were given broth, honey water, prayers, and poetry. Gentle music was played. Midwives and attendants gathered in advance, preparing ointments and pillows and sheets. But even with wealth and clergy, no woman could purchase safety. The pain was the same, the risk unchanged. Death visited high and low without distinction, and every birth was a gamble of breath. The peasant woman had no chamber, only the corner of her cottage beside the hearth, where a stack of clean linens waited, folded and refolded with trembling hands. Her sister had come to stay with her in these final days, sleeping on a mat beside the fire, offering quiet companionship. They spoke in whispers at night of their mother's labors, of childhood, games of the names they once gave to clouds. The woman admitted finally that she hoped for a girl. She could not say why exactly. Only that she wished to hold something soft and gentle, to raise a mirror of herself and pass down the lullaby she had nearly forgotten. Her sister braided her hair in long, loose coils, and they drank nettle tea in the dim light, watching the candle flame flicker as if it too was waiting. The baby had dropped lower now. She felt it pressing deep into her pelvis, grinding against bone. She waddled like a duck, and each step was a negotiation with gravity. Her bladder, once a dependable servant, betrayed her regularly. She spent her days close to the cottage, and when she did go outside, it was only to sit in the garden under the old apple tree, breathing in the late summer air, warm and damp with the promise of rain. The leaves were beginning to curl, The sun dipped faster each evening. The world was changing. And so was she. She prepared her body as best she could. The midwife had her drink infusions of raspberry leaf and comfrey, though the bitterness turned her stomach. She soaked her feet in warm water with rosemary to ease the swelling, wrapped her belly in a soft wool sash at night to support the weight. Her breasts were full now, heavy and tender, leaking tiny drops of colostrum. She wiped them gently and packed soft cloths into her bodice. The thought of nursing again both comforted and scared her. Last time, it had ended in silence. But this time, she prayed there would be a different ending. She prayed often, not in the loud, performative way of churches, but in murmurs, whispered lines as she stirred soup, folded cloth, pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the bed frame. She prayed to Mary, to her grandmother's ghost, to the saints. She remembered by face, if not name. She prayed not just for herself, but for the child, for her husband, for the women who would come to help, for the ones who would not make it. She prayed because there was nothing else left to do. And then one morning, she felt it, a tightening low in her belly, a ripple that spread across her like water spilled on cloth. It wasn't pain, not yet, but it was different. It was the first knock at the door. She said nothing, went about her chores slowly, but she knew. The next wave came just before midday, and then another, stronger. She stopped pretending then. She told her sister, who nodded and began to boil water. Word spread quickly. The midwife arrived before sunset, and with her, the quiet bustle of preparation, clean sheets laid over the straw mattress, towels folded, herbs set near the fire. A candle was lit and placed in the window, a sign to the village that labor had begun. Women passed by quietly, murmuring blessings. Someone left a basket of bread and cheese on the doorstep. The world paused. The woman lay down as instructed, her legs drawn up, her breath shallow and fast. The contractions came in waves now, deep and rhythmic. Pain bloomed across her lower back, wrapped around her like a belt of fire. She moaned softly, gripping the edge of the bed. The midwife murmured soothing words, wiped her brow, and offered her a strong tea laced with valerian. The night stretched long. Time ceased to matter. There was only breath, pain, sweat, waiting. Her body worked without her permission, without her understanding, ancient, instinctual, beyond language. She cried out, and the women beside her held her hand, whispered encouragement, stroked her hair. The room felt like a cave. The candlelight flickered on the walls like shadows in a storm. The child did not come quickly. Hours passed. She drifted in and out of lucidity, eyes rolling back, legs trembling. Blood stained the sheets. At one point, the pain was so great, she begged to be cut open, not meaning it, only wanting release. But there was no such option, only pushing, only breath and agony and effort. And then at last a scream, not her own, but the high, shrill cry of a newborn voice, cutting through the darkness like sunlight through storm clouds. The baby had arrived. The women burst into relieved tears. The midwife lifted the child, checked its limbs, wiped the blood and fluid from its mouth, and laid it on the mother's chest. A girl, tiny, wrinkled, red-faced and squalling. The woman could not speak, only cry, deep, choking sobs of exhaustion and joy. She held her daughter to her breast, skin against skin, as the midwife cut the cord and wrapped the afterbirth in cloth to be buried. The baby nursed instinctively, and the woman watched, her fingers trembling as life continued, not by miracle, but by muscle and blood and breath. Outside, the dawn was breaking. The days that followed were hushed, strange, and soft around the edges. Like walking through a dream after the fever has broken. The woman lay swaddled in wool blankets, pale and trembling, the memory of pain still clinging to her muscles like the scent of smoke to cloth. Her body was no longer her own, not entirely. It had become something else now, something used and emptied, but not ruined. Her belly, once round and firm with promise, had collapsed into soft folds. Her thighs ached. Her breasts, once tender with anticipation, were now swollen to bursting, leaking milk with every cry. But the child, her daughter, was warm and real and breathing. That was all that mattered. The child was alive, so was she. In the dark hours after birth, she had drifted between sleep and waking, her body hot and then cold, her breath shallow, her thoughts jumbled. The midwife sat by her side, watching her with eyes sharpened by years of experience. Fever could come quickly in those early hours, from torn flesh, from unseen infection, from the air itself, some whispered. With rosemary and mugwort, sips at a time, held to her lips by the steady hand of her sister. She bled steadily, but not too much. The womb, the midwife said, was closing like a sack. She pressed herbs wrapped in linen against the woman's belly, murmuring blessings, rubbing gently in circles to help the uterus contract. The pain was different now, deep, dull, insistent. But it was welcome. It meant the worst had passed. The baby slept often, curled like a comma beside her. The tiny girl had a patch of dark hair, curled fingers like threads of linen, and a cry that echoed in the woman's ears even when she slept. The child nursed greedily, mouth rooting and blind. Instinct, latching and unlatching, her tiny jaw working with a strength that surprised them all. The milk had come in quickly, warm and plentiful, though it left the woman aching, her nipples cracked and tender. Her breasts felt like stones wrapped in hot cloth, but she bore it. She had borne worse. And with every gulp, every swallow, from that tiny throat she felt something rising in her chest. Not joy exactly, but a kind of solemn relief. A tether forming, thread between two hearts. In the days that followed, women came and went from the cottage. Some brought gifts, bundles of herbs, dried apples, a pair of knitted socks no longer needed. Others came to help, to sit by the fire, and peel vegetables, to sweep the floor, to hold the baby while the mother slept. These were the unspoken rules. Childbirth was a communal act, and so was recovery. Even the priest returned, leaving a quiet blessing on the doorstep, wrapped in a small scroll of parchment and tied with a thread. The midwife stayed 2 days, then returned daily for a fortnight, checking the woman's bleeding, examining her belly, watching the baby's breath and skin. She pressed her ear against the infant's chest once and smiled. "Strong," she said. "A good heart." Outside, the leaves had begun to fall. The wind was cooler now, tugging at the roof and scattering yellow leaves across the path. The baby was kept swaddled in layers of wool, her tiny face peeking from beneath a linen cap. The woman no longer left her bed except to use the chamber, pot, or warm herself by the fire. Her legs still shook when she stood. Her back ached. Sometimes she wept without knowing why. Deep, sudden tears that came in silence and vanished just as quickly. She worried over every movement the baby made, every noise, every silence. At night, when the child slept too soundly, she would place her hand against the tiny chest to feel the rise and fall of breath. It was a fear known to every mother in every village. Babies were so small. Life was so fragile. Milk was not the only nourishment. The baby was rubbed with warm oil, pressed from poppy seed and nettle, to keep her skin soft and ward off the chill. Her cords were wrapped tightly to help shape her limbs, her head bound gently to ensure proper form. These were not superstitions, but traditions, shaped by time and habit. Some believed a child's future health depended on the first month, the way she was handled, fed, swaddled. The mother sang softly as she rocked her daughter, not songs with words, but sounds low, humming tones that calmed her own heart as much as the child's. It was a music older than memory, the man of the house. The father was quieter than usual. He moved gently now, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. He had not attended the birth. Few men did, but when he held the child for the first time, he looked down at her with wide, unreadable eyes. He said nothing, only nodded once, and placed a rough finger against the baby's hand. She gripped it tightly. Later he carved her name, chosen by the mother, whispered to her in a dream into a piece of wood that would hang above the hearth. That was his offering, his way of binding her to the world. A week after birth, the woman was able to stand longer, to walk slowly across the room. She resumed small tasks, heating broth, folding cloth, humming to herself. She was not yet whole. The recovery of the body was slow, and in truth, never fully complete. Many women bore the signs of birth for life: loosened joints, chronic pain, leaking milk long after weaning, or an aching womb that reminded them, always, of what they had survived. There was no word for postpartum in her language, no diagnosis, no prescription, but the midwives knew, the other women knew. Softness had settled in her gaze, a new stillness in her voice, as if she had crossed a river and returned changed by the 12th day. The village priest returned for the rite of purification, known as churching. It was a ritual reserved for women after childbirth, regardless of status. It served not only to give thanks for a safe delivery, but to cleanse the woman, to return her to society. For childbirth, though sacred, was also considered dangerous, a liminal act that brushed against death, and thus carried a kind of spiritual stain. She wore her cleanest dress, hair covered, babe swaddled tightly in her arms. The priest led her in silent prayer, sprinkled holy water across her brow, and gave her communion. Afterward, she was declared clean, not because she had sinned, but because she had suffered. She was no longer only a mother. She was a woman reborn. The baby began to grow slowly. Her cries changed pitch, her eyes opened wider. She recognized her mother's scent now, her voice. When laid down, she fussed until she was held again. The woman slept with the baby against her chest, both wrapped in wool and tucked into the cradle. She woke often, always, her body alert to every stir. But in those quiet hours, while the fire crackled low and the wind bent around the cottage, she felt something new. Something fierce and warm, kindling inside her. Not pride, not even joy, but a kind of awe. She had made this. She had suffered and survived, and now the world was new again, filtered through a pair of tiny blinking eyes. And still, there was fear. Illness could strike without warning. Croup, fever, colic. Death visited children often in these times. It hovered at windows, crept into lungs, stole breath in the night. The woman knew this. Every mother did. And yet she loved the child with a tenderness so vast it frightened her. She whispered blessings into the baby's hair, rubbed her feet with warm oil, hung a pouch of herbs above the cradle. Each night, she lit a candle and whispered the same prayer. Let her stay. And in the dark, beneath the watch of stars, the baby stirred, sighed, and slept. Time did not return all at once. It came in cautious steps, like a bird testing a branch after rain. First, her days were still ruled by her body, tender, healing, raw. The wound of birth was not visible from the outside, but she felt it. In every joint, every breath, every quiet ache in the bones of her hips. But her hands remembered their duties. Slowly, as if learning again, she returned to the rhythm of labor, stirring pots, sweeping floors, kneading bread, though she did. So with the child always near, the baby, now 3 weeks old, cried louder, squirmed more confidently, and quieted only when held close. She had already grown, her legs stretched longer, her cheeks fuller, her eyes more awake. The mother learned to tell hunger from gasps, gas from dreams. She could now soothe her with a hum and a sway, a soft cloth warmed by the fire. A touch of her own forehead against the child's. The cottage had returned to its former quiet, but something in it had changed. The cradle was now part of the furniture. The scent of milk and baby skin lingered in the air, and the fire seemed to burn, not just for warmth, but for protection. Neighbors stopped by less frequently now. The birth had passed. Life went on. Other women grew round with child. Others buried theirs. A boy drowned in the river one morning. A widow miscarried in her 3rd month. The woman heard these stories from the well, from the baker's wife, from children playing too loudly just outside her window. Life, that unruly, unpredictable, miraculous thing, had returned to its relentless turning. And in it, she was not just a survivor, but a mother again. To be a mother in medieval times was not a role wrapped in lace and lullabies. It was a duty and a burden and a fragile hope all at once. The mother was expected to nurse her child for at least a year, often 2. If her milk ran dry, she could seek a wet nurse. But in poor villages, this was rare, church encouraged. Breastfeeding, they called it a moral good, a divine function, and warned that a woman who refused to nurse might endanger her child's soul. So she nursed through pain, through sleeplessness, through fever. Her breasts remained sore. Back ached from the hours of rocking, of leaning forward. Her nipples cracked again and again, but she did not complain. She had heard too many stories of children lost to goat's milk, to rotten barley pap, to the thin gruel given when no other option remained. She would not risk it. Her body had fed the child for 9 months before. It would continue to do so. For as long as needed, her husband returned to work at the cooperage, spending long hours fitting iron rings around barrels while the baby slept against her chest. He did not say much, but sometimes brought small gifts of plum from the market, a scrap of soft cloth from a nobleman's cast-offs. Once he brought a doll carved from wood, its features smoothed by his thumb, its arms stiff and simple. She thanked him quietly. It was not love, as poets wrote it. There were no grand declarations, but there was a silent respect that moved between them now, unspoken but true. He had watched her suffer. She had survived. In that survival, they had grown older together, even if no one could see the change. As her body healed, her place in the village returned. She resumed work in the garden, pulled weeds between feedings, carried her child on her hip as she walked to the stream. The other women asked about the baby. They smiled, offered tips, shared cloth or extra honey when they could, but beneath every kindness was the shared knowledge of risk. In a world of sickness, war, and famine, every mother knew that a child could slip away at any moment. Croup, chills, worms, coughs, all could take a baby in a single night, so they whispered protective charms. They kept salt in the corners of cradles. They hung iron above the doors. They never ever said she will live, because to speak it was to tempt fate. She learned not to boast of milestones. The baby's first smile was met not with cheers, but with silence and a soft murmur of thanks. When the child laughed, a high, breathy chuckle, she wept quietly while holding her to the window, letting the sun kiss her face. But she told no one, not at first. Joy was sacred. Joy was fragile. And in these times, you did not flaunt such treasures. The church taught that children were born stained by original sin, and baptism was urgent. Her daughter had been baptized 2 days after birth, wrapped in white wool, carried to the chapel with a ribbon of blue tied around her wrist. The priest had anointed her head with oil and water, whispered Latin over her, and marked her for heaven. The mother remembered the moment clearly, the cold water, the soft wail, the candle held aloft. It was not just ceremony, it was armor. Without baptism, if the child died, her soul would be in limbo, a concept that haunted many mothers in their dreams. She had seen one woman nearly go mad with grief after her child died before a priest could be found. She was determined that her daughter would not suffer that fate. As the weeks stretched into months, the bond between mother and child deepened. The baby learned her mother's smell, her voice, her footfall on the cottage floor. She turned toward her when she entered the room, blinked with sleepy recognition, cried only when left too long in the cradle. The woman began to feel herself again, not just a vessel or a patient, but a person. Her humor returned in flashes. Her appetite grew. She even sang again while working, old rhymes half remembered from her youth. She was not whole. Not yet. But the pieces of herself were falling back into place, shaped now by this new soul that depended on her completely. But not all days were soft. There were days of fever, when her breasts flared red and hot, and the baby's nursing brought tears to her eyes. There were nights when the child screamed for hours, inconsolable, and her arms felt like lead. There were moments when she looked down at the baby, this perfect, fragile, needy thing, and felt a brief flicker of fear, of resentment, a fatigue so sharp it made her dizzy. She told no one. There were no words for such feelings in her world, only guilt. But the next morning, when the baby cooed and reached for her hair with soft, sticky fingers, the guilt melted as it always did, and she carried on. In time, the seasons turned. The baby sat upright, her hair grew longer, Her legs kicked against the straw mattress. She teethed. She laughed. The woman, now more herself than not, resumed full life. Cooking, trading at the market, laughing with neighbors. The baby was worn in a sling on her back, safe and warm, the mother's hands always free. She had survived pregnancy, birth, and the uncertain months after. The hardest part, she knew, was not over. It never would be. But the silence that had once haunted her had not returned. And that, in these times, was more than many women could ask for. She lit a candle every evening still. She did not pray for riches or safety or miracles, only this. Let her wake. Let her grow. Let me see her first steps. Let me hold her through one more night. Years passed, as they always did, quietly and without permission. The child who once fit in the crook of her mother's arm grew longer, heavier, louder. She learned to crawl, then walk. First like a drunken lamb, then with the sure-footed boldness of youth. She spoke her first words in bursts of syllables, shaped not by grammar, but by hunger and love. She called for her mother in the night, reached for her in storms, followed her shadow across fields and floorboards. And the woman, though older now, answered every call, not with fanfare, but with a hand, a song, a slice of bread. That was the ordinary miracle of motherhood. No one applauded it. No one bowed. But the world turned because of it. Her body never fully healed. The line of her belly bore a soft sag, the proof of life having stretched it to its limits. In cold weather, her breasts, once tender with milk, had returned to their shape, but never their youth. Some days her knees burned with a stiffness that hadn't been there before, but she did not mourn the change. Her body had carried, nourished, birthed, and fed a child, but had walked through fire and returned. She touched the lines of her stretch marks sometimes in the bath, not with shame, but with reverence. This was the text her life had written on her skin. No ink, only flesh, only memory. She had other children in time, a son, then another. Daughter, each birth a different ordeal, each child a different song. But the first one had shaped her most deeply. The first had shown her the steep cliff between life and death, and the trembling path between. She had nearly lost her mind after that birth, though no one had noticed. There were no names for it then, no words for the way she had stared at the wall for hours, for the way the child's cry had made her heart race with fear instead of joy, for the darkness that sometimes pressed against her when she was alone. But she had climbed back, slowly through milk and lullabies, through scraped knees and soft wet cheeks pressed to hers. She had survived not just the pain of birth, but the quiet ache of returning. Others had not been so lucky. She knew women who bled out in the night while their babies cried beside them. She had stood at burials for mothers barely older than girls. She had seen cradles burn in house fires, watched infants wither under fever, heard the keening wail of a woman whose stillborn child was wrapped in a shroud before it was ever given a name. These stories were part of her, too, each one carved into her with a quiet knife. That was motherhood in medieval times. Not a role, but a crossing. Not an ideal, but a daily climb. And at the heart of it was not simply joy or sorrow, but a bone-deep endurance that did not need to speak its name. Faith helped, though it did not always heal. The church spoke of Mary, the Mother of God, as a model, serene, humble, pure. But the woman knew there was more to it. She imagined Mary not just in holy robes, but bent over in pain, sweating through her veil, nursing in silence, while the world looked away. She prayed not to the painted saints, but to the women buried beneath unmarked stones in the churchyard. The ones who had done the same as she endured, bled, wept, hoped. She lit candles for them. She whispered their names when she could remember. When she could not, she simply said, "For her." The child, now grown, never knew all that her mother had done. She knew only that there was always warmth in her mother's arms, bread on the table, lullabies when the wind howled against the shutters. That was the inheritance passed down. Not gold, not land, not title, but safety, made by hands that had trembled and still worked. The woman did not ask for thanks. Her daughter gave it anyway in soft good nights, in the way she reached for her mother's hand without thinking, in the way she cried at the sight of its first breath. In old age, the woman's memories became soft. Not faded, but softened, like linen worn through by use. She remembered the smell of rosemary tea in early pregnancy, the feel of her swollen belly in summer, the first time her baby kicked. She remembered the pain so sharp, so consuming, but also the silence after, when the baby's cry cut through the dark, and she knew they had both survived. She remembered the fear, the sacred dread, the awe. She remembered how time had folded in those days, how each hour of labor had felt like a year, and how the first time she held her daughter felt like both the beginning and the end of everything. Her children grew. Some stayed, some left. Husband died one winter, quietly in his sleep, and she lit a candle for him every day until her hands could no longer strike the flint. Her daughter became a mother. Her granddaughter was born in the same cottage, with the same midwife's apprentice at her side. And the woman, though bent with age, sat near the hearth and hummed the same old tunes she had once sung to calm her. Babies. Time had not forgotten her. It had simply moved past her, leaving behind this, the quiet, sacred mark of one who had walked the ancient path and come through with stories woven not into books, but into flesh, into blood, into the breath of her descendants. In the end, her legacy was not measured in words or records. It was held in the way her daughter swaddled her child, in the herbs chosen for a tea, in the way her name was whispered before sleep. She had lived what thousands of women had lived before her, the terror, the tenderness, the tired love of pregnancy and motherhood in an unforgiving world. And though the world had never paused for her, she had paused for it, again and again. Every time a child reached for her hand, and that was enough. She sat by the window now, most days, wrapped in a shawl too big for her shoulders, watching the wind play tricks with the grass. Her fingers no longer threaded needles as they once did, and her knees no longer bent to gather firewood. Her mind was filled with echoes. Pregnancy, though it had come and gone many times, remained a presence. Not as pain, not even as memory, but as shape, the shape of her life. It had changed the way she walked, the way she sat, the way she prayed. It had changed the way she looked at other women, with softness, with knowing. The younger ones came, to her, sometimes nervously twisting aprons in their hands, asking questions they couldn't voice aloud. She listened. Sometimes she offered herbs, sometimes just silence. Not every fear had a cure. Not every sorrow had words. Her daughters had children of their own. Some births were long. Some were cruelly short. One of her daughters lost to infants. Before the first frost, another nearly died of fever after her second. She had been there for both, not as a midwife, not as a healer, but as a steady presence. The woman who knew, who had seen, who had borne the weight of life and the grief of it. Her hands were thin now, the bones sharp beneath her skin, but her voice still carried calm. She had learned long ago that the most powerful thing you could say to a laboring woman was not instruction. It was simply, "You are not alone." She could no longer walk far, but when the church bells rang, she closed her eyes and said the words from memory. Prayer had grown less formal in her old age. It was no longer shaped by fear or dogma, but by love. She no longer asked for mercy. She asked for time, more time to see her grandchildren grow, to teach them the herbs, to sing them the songs that no longer lived in books. She whispered over them while they slept, the same way she had whispered to her own in the cradle. She would run her fingers through their hair and remember. Viscerally, the feeling of their mothers in the womb, the way each had kicked differently, stretched differently, been born with different cries. Even now, those memories remained, alive in her skin. More vivid than anything she'd eaten yesterday, she sometimes dreamed of her first pregnancy, though it had been half a lifetime ago. In the dreams, she was not in pain. She was walking through the barley fields, her belly round, the sun warm on her face. She could hear the baby's heartbeat through her palms. She could feel the child's breath before it was born. The wind whispered old names. Her mother's voice was near. And though she woke to aching bones and dim light, the dream always left her smiling. One winter, and snow crept under the door, and the wind wailed like a lost widow, a young woman came to her door in tears. She was alone, unmarried, pregnant. Terrified, the village was whispering already. The church offered only shame. The girl was thin, shivering, clutching her belly with both arms. Old woman said nothing. She simply opened her door, made space by the fire, and handed her a mug of hot broth. No judgment, no lectures, only warmth. She gave her a cot by the window. And when the girl eventually went into labor, screaming, bleeding, nearly delirious, the old woman stayed with her through the night. She rubbed her back with warm oil, murmured prayers in an old tongue, and caught the child herself. A girl, strong lungs, full head of hair. When it was over, the young woman collapsed in two, sobs, whispering, "I can't do this." The old woman took the newborn in her arms, wrapped her in the wool she had saved for her own death shroud, and replied softly, "You already have." She never told anyone that story. There was no need. She had lived many lives in her one life. Daughter, sister, wife, mother, midwife by necessity, widow, elder. But beneath all of them, she had always remained a woman shaped by birth, by the silent burden of carrying, by the breaking open, by the rebuilding that followed. She did not speak of it often. Men did not ask. And most women carried it inside themselves quietly. But she knew that every stone in the village road had been stepped on by a woman who had done the same. The world had been built on backs like hers, and still, the seasons came and went. Her body failed slowly, piece by piece. Her vision blurred, her hearing dulled, but her memory that remained. Not names, not dates, but the feel of a baby's. Foot inside her belly, pressing against the world. The stretch of her skin as it made room for something greater than itself. The heat of labor, the coldness after. The moment the crying began, the silence of night feedings. The weight of her daughter asleep on her chest. These were not memories. They were her. They were her body, her breath, her bones. One evening, as the fire burned low and the youngest granddaughter nestled beside her, the girl asked what was the hardest thing you ever did. The woman did not answer right away. She looked into the flame. She thought of plagues, of cold winters, of empty larders and burial cloths. But she also thought of the blood-streaked cradle, the way her legs had shook beneath her during her first labor, the scent of milk-soaked linen. The silence after her second was stillborn, the unbearable strength it took to begin again. She said finally, with a tired smile, becoming someone's beginning. The days had grown shorter now. The fire needed tending sooner, and even the roosters seemed slower to crow. She no longer rose with the sun, but with the stirring sounds of the house, a kettle clanking, a child coughing in sleep, the shuffle of her daughter's footsteps across the floorboards. Her place had shifted, from center to circle, from bearer to keeper. She was no longer the one who gave birth. She was the one who remembered birth. And in that remembering, there was a kind of quiet power. The others came to her more often now. Not just with questions, but with fears. Would the baby turn? Would the milk come in time? What if the bleeding didn't stop? And sometimes, though her voice was rough with age, she told them the truth, that nothing was promised, but everything was possible, that their bodies were stronger than they knew. Pain did not mean failure, that survival could be silent and still be holy. In the folds of her gown, she kept small relics, not of saints, but of motherhood. A bit of the wool from her first cradle. A button from the shirt her son had worn the first time he walked. A ribbon her third daughter had wrapped around her braid before her wedding. And one soft scrap of cloth, frayed and stained. From the child she had lost between summers, the one who had never drawn breath but still appeared in dreams holding out a flower, always smiling. She never spoke of that child. No one asked. But she carried her always. In the ache of her knees, the way her voice softened around infants. In the candle she lit each winter solstice. Letting the wax run without speaking the reason, time, she had learned, was not a line, but a loop. The same pain returned in new voices. The same hope grew inside new bellies. The same lullabies were, sung in different tones. She would sit and listen to her granddaughters argue about herbs and midwives, about salt around cradles, about which saints to pray to for a breached child. She did not correct them. Every woman needed to find her own faith. But when they left the room, she would hum the tune her mother had sung to her, the one with no words, only rhythm. Like a heartbeat beneath earth, like the sound of blood. Rushing just before a cry, her name was not carved anywhere important. It would not be written in a ledger. She had not founded anything. She had not held a title. She had not led men into war or walked in courts. But she had grown children from her flesh. She had wept over lost ones. She had bled and healed. She had taught others to bleed and heal. She had held the hands of girls who trembled in labor, whispered the breath patterns that carried them through, caught babies in the dark when no one else was awake. She had changed the world, not loudly but deeply, through bodies, through touch, through milk, through death and birth, and death again. One morning near the end, she asked to be helped to the garden. The apple tree was bare, but she wanted to sit beneath it one last time. The youngest child, her great-granddaughter, small and barefoot, led her by the hand, giggling with pride. They sat in silence beneath the gray branches. Air was cold, sharp in the nose. The leaves had gone. The ground was hard. Yet she felt it again, the same quiet she had felt so many years ago. When she first pressed her hands to her belly and whispered, "You are here," she was still that woman. Just older now, just layered in stories. And as the wind rustled the brittle grass, she whispered aloud to no one in particular, "I did it. Not perfectly, not without sorrow. Wholly, utterly, with everything she had." Her breath had begun to shorten, not in an alarming way, but gradually, like a long song nearing its final verse. Her days were slower now. The mornings came with stiffness in her joints. The evenings with a heaviness that tugged at her eyelids before the sun had fully gone. But she did not fear it. She had known fear before, fear of blood that wouldn't stop, of breath that wouldn't come, of a cradle that stayed still in the night. What she felt now was something else, a release, a loosening, as though the threads that had tied her to this world, the cords of duty, love, memory, were gently being untied, not cut. And yet she clung, still not out of desperation, but out of reverence. This life had been hard, yes, but it had been hers. She spent more time by the fire. Sometimes her fingers moved without thought, smoothing the edges of a blanket, retying. A bundle of herbs, tracing the grain of the wood on the arms of the chair. Her hands had once caught a child, had once scraped root vegetables for soup while holding a baby at her breast. They had kneaded dough while telling stories. They'd wiped the tears of frightened daughters. Now they simply moved, quietly remembering. Her mind wandered often. She would drift mid-conversation, staring into the hearth, hearing voices from long ago. Her mother's laughter, her sister's lullabies, the sharp cry of her firstborn. These were not ghosts, not entirely, were companions, familiar ones. Each week, her daughters visited, carrying news of the world harvests. Illnesses, weddings, the birth of yet another grandchild. They came with baskets of fruit, new shawls, combs, ribbons, stories. She listened. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she dozed off mid-story, and no one minded. The room was full of patience. Her presence was no longer needed to guide, but to remember. Her home had become a hearthstone, a still point around which generations gathered, even when she said nothing at all. One rainy afternoon, she asked for something she hadn't spoken of in years. The linen, now wrapped tightly and stored for decades. It was the cloth she had prepared herself when she was younger. Back when she had buried her stillborn son, she had woven it with her own hands, in the silence that followed his death, threading sorrow into each stitch. She never used it. It was too beautiful for that. But she kept it. And now, she asked to see it again. When it was brought to her, she laid it across her lap and ran her fingers across the edge, eyes closed. Then she handed it to her granddaughter, with both hands, and said only, "This is for the next one. Use it well." She did not speak of dying. That was not her way. but she began to leave small things behind, quietly. Her comb was passed to the child who had always liked it. Her necklace with the iron cross once hung above her birthing. Bed was given to the eldest daughter who had inherited her fierce silence. Her book of herbs, written in fading ink, went to the girl who liked to crush mint between her fingers. These were not gifts in the way nobles gave them. They were continuations. Pieces of her that would live on through other hands. One night, the wind howled louder than usual, shaking the shutters and scattering ash from the hearth. She did not wake easily. Her breathing was light. A granddaughter sat beside her, humming the same lullaby the old woman had sung decades ago to her own daughters. The fire burned low. The room was warm. In the early hours, the old woman stirred. Slightly, blinked toward the dark ceiling and whispered something no one could fully understand. A name, perhaps, or a prayer. Then her breathing stopped. She did not cry out. There was no struggle, only stillness. In the days that followed, the house was filled with women. Some wept. Others sat in silence. The men carried wood, prepared the ground, did as they were told. The body was washed gently, her hair combed, her hands folded across her chest. The linen, the one from so long ago, was finally used, not as she had once feared, but as she had intended. A shroud not of mourning, but of memory. The priest spoke at the burial, but his Latin was distant, formal. The truer words were spoken later, by the fire. In stories whispered among the women who had known her, she was the one who stayed when my mother died in labor. She caught my son before the midwife arrived. She gave me fennel and made me believe I could do it. She never asked for thanks. She just showed up. Her grave was marked by a stone, simple and smooth, with her name and the year. But that was not her legacy. Her legacy was in the hands that lit candles in the windows during labor, in the way girls learned to wrap swaddling cloths, in the pot of nettle tea made at the first signs of nausea, in the silence women kept beside each other when words would fail, in the lullabies that had no beginning and no end, just breath and tone passed down like heirlooms. She had lived as thousands of women lived, through fear, through blood, through quiet endurance. She had carried life, lost it, grown it, grieved it. She had been the vessel and the voice, the keeper of knowledge that was never written, only whispered. And in that, she had been everything. The seasons moved forward, as they always did. Spring crept back into the village, green and shy, pressing up through the cracks in the stone paths and painting the hedgerows with yellow flowers. The cottage where she had once lived remained, its hearthstone warm, its shutters mended again and again by hands younger than hers. Her room stayed mostly untouched, not as a shrine, but as a quiet corner where something still lingered. Her shawl was still folded on the chair, carved. Doll sat quietly near the cradle. Cradle itself had not been used in years, but no one had the heart to store it away. It remained like a well-worn hymn, half forgotten but ready to be sung. The women in the village still spoke of her, not daily, not dramatically, but as part of stories that emerged naturally. When I was carrying Marjorie, one woman would say while steeping thyme in a bowl, she told me to walk backward 3 steps before sunrise to ease the hip pain. I laughed then, but it worked. Or she used to say rosemary by the door keeps the pain from entering. I do it still, just in case. Her name became an ingredient, a line in an old recipe, a whispered prayer before labor. She was no longer a person. She had become a presence. There were times during difficult births when someone would pause, hand on belly, and say aloud, "Let her be with me now." No candles, no chants, just that. And though no wind blew and no miracle arrived, something settled in the room, steadiness maybe, a hush. And the work continued. The youngest girls, those born long after she had passed, knew only her stories. But even they felt her shadow in the softness of the cradle's linen, in the burn of nettle tea, in the songs sung over fevered brows. Her memory was not passed down through books or ink, but through patterns, through habits, through things women did without remembering why. And this, more than anything, was what she had given the world, a rhythm of care, a way of being that held the broken and the brave alike. Her granddaughter, the one who had once braided flowers into her hair and slept beside her during those last winters, grew into a woman of her own. When she had her first child, she did not call for the priest first. She called for her mother, her sister, and the midwife. And when the pain became too much, when she thought she might break, she held fast to a piece of wool cloth, torn from an old wrap that had once been her great-grandmother's. She did not remember why she kept it. She only knew it calmed her. When her baby cried for the first time, tears on her cheeks were not only hers, they belonged to every woman before her who had once thought she couldn't, still did. The generations moved on, but the thread never broke. It wove through kitchens, through quiet rooms lit only by firelight, through fields where girls walked with hands pressed to their bellies, wondering if they were with child, curled through lullabies hummed by voices that didn't know the words. It whispered in the choices women made without knowing why. She had not written a book, but she had written herself into the body of the world. And if, one night centuries later, a woman were to kneel by a window in some far cottage and light a candle for courage, before childbirth, if she whispered a name she could not place, it would be because something of that old woman, once wrapped in linen and prayer and milk and blood, still stirred in the bones of the world. The world changed, slowly, unevenly, like the shifting of stones beneath a river. Roads widened, towns grew, markets bustled with new goods, and the old ways began to fray at the edges. But in the quiet corners, in kitchens, in cradles, in garden plots behind low stone walls, some things did not change. Not completely. Not where the women were, not where the memory lived. By the time the next century rolled over the hills, the old woman's name had blurred. It became Maud, too. Some mother to others. In certain regions, she was the midwife by the woods, or the woman with the nettle hands. The specifics no longer mattered. What remained was the rhythm, the pattern, the way she had lived and taught others to live, through small kindnesses, through fierce endurance, through the humble, sacred work of carrying life forward one breath at a time. Her descendants carried more than her blood, carried her gestures, a way of cooling fevered skin with damp linen, a way of mixing elderflower and rosehip in water before a birth, a way of placing salt at thresholds and murmuring. Protection not as spell, but as habit. One daughter in a fishing village passed down a small leather pouch with chamomile and iron tucked inside for the child, she said, though she couldn't recall why. In a northern hill town, a woman stitched a cradle lining in a pattern no one else used, looped and tucked, stitched with a whisper between each pull of the needle. It was beautiful, but more than that, it felt safe. No one had taught her how. Her hands simply knew. In an abbey farther south, a nun who had once been a midwife recorded a collection of birthing prayers. She said they had come to her in dreams, from a woman with gray eyes and weathered hands who spoke only in plants. The church did not canonize the collection, but some of the younger sisters memorized the verses anyway. They tucked them under pillows when laboring women came to the gates after dark. Centuries passed, and still in the margins of proper books, among recipes and star charts, scribes and wives wrote things that weren't supposed to last. Remedies. Warnings, blessings in dialects no longer spoken aloud. If the baby kicks too soon, give fennel. If her bleeding will not stop, sing low and do not touch her feet. If she weeps without reason, let her weep. These were not medical facts. They were survival songs. And somewhere in each, though no name was attached, lived the whisper of a woman who once gave birth with only a candle and a prayer to guide her. During the plagues, when the world reeled and bodies filled the fields, it was the midwives who remained when others fled. Not all could be saved. But even the dying were wrapped gently in cloth, their eyes closed, their names spoken aloud once more. For the next life, they said. So she won't forget her name when she's born again. It was an old phrase, older than plague, older than even the church's reach. It had passed from the lips of women who had no literacy but infinite knowledge. Knowledge of how to bury with tenderness, how to birth without fear, to grieve while continuing to cook soup. When modern maps were drawn, her village had no name worth recording. it was just another green smear beyond the river, marked only by a well and a crossroads. But if you had gone there, if you had wandered through in the early spring, you might have found an old tree still standing, gnarled and bare with strips of ribbon tied to its branches. No one could say who had started the practice. Some tied blue for sons, white for daughters, red for protection. Others came in silence, touched the bark, and left without explaining. It was not pagan. It was not Christian. It was older than both. It was hers. The woman who once whispered over bellies and buried her, its firstborn wrapped in a wool cloth she'd made herself. The books got heavier, the doctors more official, the remedies more chemical. But still, in old farmhouses and low cottages, women reached for the same plants, folded the same cloths, whispered the same things their grandmothers had. Even when they laughed about it, even when they said, "It's silly," I know they did it, because something in their bones remembered. Her legacy was not carved in marble, nor etched in ink. It was in muscle memory, in heat drawn by a hand to a womb, in the breath taken before the final push. In the prayer spoken without words, the world forgot her name, but the world never stopped living, or the way she taught it to live. The world had changed again. Horses gave way to wheels. Cities rose like forests made of brick and soot. The air thickened with smoke and iron. Children were born not beside hearths, but in hospital wards lit with gas lamps. Replaced the midwife's shawl. Books replaced memory. Measurements replaced instinct. Progress came loudly with charts and clocks and cold instruments. But in the quiet places, something older still held. A woman in a coal-streaked alley gave birth on a straw mattress. The midwife beside her, sleeves rolled, face calm. There was a priest 2 streets over, a doctor in a pressed coat pacing at the edge of the door. But it was the midwife who whispered, "Breathe now. Breathe like the wind before a storm." She had learned it not in school, but from her mother, who had learned it from hers, who had learned it without knowing from the woman who once sang, in the dark, with a baby on her chest. The rituals had changed names, not shapes. When the bleeding came too fast, they reached for shepherds, purse, and vinegar. When the mother's mind went still and sad, they placed lavender near her pillow, opened the window wide, and stayed beside her in silence. No one called it postpartum melancholy. It was just the sorrow that needed warmth and time and someone who knew when not to speak. In the cramped streets of London, a girl was born with a knot in her umbilical cord. The midwife unwrapped it gently, whispering the Lord's Prayer with one hand and reaching for a poultice with the other. The child lived. No one wrote it down. When that girl grew, she became a midwife herself. When asked how she had, "Learned to act so quickly," she said. "It's what my grandmother would have done." Her grandmother had lived in a village with no map, but her hands still held the memory of those before her, even in the grand houses of the wealthy, where physicians came with gloves and silver forceps. The mothers often asked for the nursemaid first, the older woman who brought broths and prayers and held the infant with practiced steadiness. She would walk slowly into the nursery, hum something no one else remembered, and whisper as she bathed the child, "Grow slow, breathe easy. You've already done enough, little one." The nursemaids never wrote their names, but they carried the same knowledge, folded and passed like linen, quiet as milk. In America, on a wide plain, in a cabin made of split timber, a young woman gave birth alone. The storms had cut off help. Her husband boiled water, pale and wide-eyed. She leaned against the edge of the bed, her body screaming, her voice steady. She said aloud, "I've got you. I've got you," though she was talking to no one, or maybe to the baby, or maybe to the memory of a woman she had never known, who once whispered the same words during a night of thunder and blood. The child came. The mother bled. The husband wept. The woman wrapped the baby in a woolen cloth she had made months before and whispered, "You are here. You made it." Factories grew taller. Cities swallowed fields. But even as birth moved, into wards and clinics, the old ways clung. Midwives brought charms hidden in coat pockets, pressed flowers, braided threads, A small scrap of cloth, not for function, for memory. Women still lit candles when labor began. They still hummed. They still asked, even under fluorescent lights, "Is this normal?" And they still wept, not from weakness, but from the weight of it all. The ancient weight of bringing something into the world that might not stay, and every time someone remembered to whisper, she did it too. The one before you. In a cottage that had once belonged to the old woman, now rebuilt in stone and fitted with windows that shut tight, a great-great-granddaughter gave birth to twins. Her mother stood beside her. So did the midwife. Outside, machines groaned, and wagons passed by. But inside, it was as it had always been. Water steaming on the fire, cloth ready, oil warming in a bowl, and the voice of the mother saying quietly, "When I was born, your grandmother did this. When she was born, hers did too." No one had written it down. But the body remembered, because the truth was, while the world grew faster and colder and louder, birth never did. It stayed raw. It stayed slow. It stayed rooted in the same rituals that had once steadied a woman in a dark room with a candle, a prayer, and a body split open not by violence, but by love and somewhere behind. All those hands was hers. The beds became narrower. The sheets became whiter. There were clipboards now and wires. Pain had new names. Contractions were measured by numbers on screens. Nurses moved efficiently, with gloves and charts, and birth became something spoken. Of in schedules, managed in time blocks. Yet beneath it all, under the soft whir of machines and the antiseptic scent of disinfectant, nothing essential had changed. A woman still walked the floor of her small apartment, hands cradling the swell of her belly, breath shallow with fear. The lights above her hummed. Her phone buzzed with texts. But when the first pain hit, low and strong and undeniable, she dropped her phone, grabbed the table's edge, and exhaled the way her grandmother once had. The way her great-grandmother had. She hadn't been taught. Her body knew. Another woman labored in a hospital room, her partner beside her holding a paper cup of ice chips. There were monitors beeping, midwives watching graphs, doctors in blue gowns. But when the pain peaked and her world narrowed to a scream and a breath and a push, the room melted away. She wasn't in a hospital. She was in the same space that had held every woman before her, the threshold, ancient, trembling doorway between death and life, between one breath and the next. When the child emerged, slick, red, alive, she cried. Not because she had read that birth was sacred, but because it was. And no technology could soften the weight of that moment. They didn't call it prayer anymore, not always.
Oh.
But still. Candles were lit on kitchen counters, in bathtubs, beside birth pools. Some still turned to herbs, though the jars came from health stores now, labeled in Latin and packaged in glass. Raspberry leaf tea still brewed in mugs before labor. Lavender oil still dabbed on wrists. Women still hummed low when the pain came. Even when the doula called it vocal toning, even when the midwife said, "This will help your diaphragm," no one called it magic. But it was. Photographs captured what once was lost to memory. The moment a woman collapsed into herself with pain. The raw beauty of a newborn pressed to skin. The first cry, the first feeding. What couldn't be captured was older still. The look in a mother's eyes the first time she realized her body had built something from blood and silence. That expression was the same, whether seen by firelight or fluorescent bulb. Fear, disbelief, love too large for language. There were still miscarriages, still stillbirths, still losses that carved holes too deep to fill. But now there were words. Words like grief work, postpartum depression, support group, therapy. And yet, in the quiet moments, after the visitors had gone, when the room fell into dimness, mothers still whispered to the air, just as the old woman once had, "I miss you. You were real. I will not forget you." The language had changed, the need had not, and the lullabies, well, they still came. Now they floated from Bluetooth speakers, from worn lips singing to bassinets in city towers. They were no longer in Latin or Breton or Old English. But their rhythm, the slow hush of breath, meant to mimic the womb, the heartbeats sung in song, remained. Some still sang without meaning to. Well, folding laundry, clicking their tongue to soothe the baby in line at the store, rocking on the balls of their feet while thinking of something else. Taxes, bills, dinner, but still rocking, still swaying, still repeating the same motions, passed down like secret maps through the body. The science was sharper now. We knew more, and still, women reached for their mothers, or lit candles when alone, or pressed warm towels to their own backs in the night, or whispered to their belly during the final weeks. "You're almost here," the old woman's name had long since vanished, but in forums and message boards her descendants lived. This helped me. My grandma told me this. It sounds silly, but I wrap my belly in cloth when I'm scared. It calms me. And thousands of women liked the comment, shared it, sent back, "Thank you. I'll try that too." That was her. Still moving, still alive, not as a ghost. As a rhythm, she had once boiled herbs over a fire. Now her voice was felt in birth playlists, in hospital go-bags packed with lavender and honey, in instinct, in gesture, in breath. She had once whispered over a cradle by moonlight. Now her voice echoed in a mother who, unable to sleep, placed her hand over her baby's chest in the dark and whispered, "I'm still here. I've got you." Because the world changed, but motherhood didn't, and the old woman never really left. The centuries kept turning. The machines grew smaller, faster. The cities rose higher. The lights became constant. No more dark nights unless one made them. People spoke through invisible threads, lived in walls of glass and steel, flew through the sky as easily as birds. Language changed. Families changed. The very shape of life seemed to shift borders, nations, beliefs. Everything broke and reformed and broke again. But still, in rooms quieted for labor, the same stillness fell. A woman in a future not yet born lay on a surface smooth as marble. Her heartbeat monitored in a blue light that pulsed like a second sun. Around her, quiet hums of sterile precision. Medical knowledge had grown immense. DNA sequenced, cells tracked in real time, pain managed by invisible devices. And yet, as her contractions began, she turned her face to the wall and whispered. To herself, not a calculation, but a prayer. Not one she had learned, one she knew. From somewhere far older than language. Please, 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 not to anyone, or maybe to someone she had never met. Someone who lived long ago. Someone who once whispered into the dark with blood on her thighs and a baby in her arms, and as the new child slipped into the world not beneath candlelight, but beneath lights too bright to name, the silence before the first cry remained. The same, timeless, awful, sacred, and when the cry came, the room didn't cheer. It exhaled. Her partner held her hand. Machines beeped gently. A nurse smiled. But none of them could explain the weight in the woman's chest, the way she clutched the child, not as if it were new, but as if it were ancient. A returning. A reunion. Somewhere deep in her bones she remembered. Not a face, not a name. A rhythm. She remembered the feel of cloth soaked in warm water, the smell of iron and lavender, the song with no lyrics, the way a woman's breath sounds when it is not just pain, but becoming. She remembered a cradle shaped from oak. She remembered nettle tea. She remembered a garden, a shawl, a fire, and the steady, steady hands of someone who had once said, "You can do this." Even in the future, when memory fails, when history erases, when paper turns to ash and data disappears, the body still knows, because the woman who once gave birth in the dark of a medieval world, with only her breath and her prayer and her strength, never truly vanished. She had passed into pattern, into the motion of rocking, into the tone of voice we use to speak to new life, into the way we hold something we might lose. Her legacy was not bound to a century, or a cradle, or a name. Her legacy was the rhythm of care, the courage to birth. Through pain, the strength to keep loving even after loss, and as long as there is breath in a mother's lungs. As long as children cry into the night, as long as someone whispers, "I've got you in the dark." She is here, she is home, she is forever. Asterisk in the ages yet to come, long after the names of cities have been forgotten. After the wires and towers have rusted down to root and ash, her memory still lingers. Not as a ghost, not as history, but as code. Stored in quiet places, inside machines shaped like stars, among memory systems built to hold everything we once were. Someone no one remembers who built a library of the body, of breath, of birth, of love. Not of kings or conquerors, but of ordinary lives, and in it, she waits. Not her face, not her voice, but her echo. A hum recorded from a birthing room in 1427. A prayer scratched into a wax tablet by candlelight. A lullaby encoded from the breath of someone who never learned to read, but learned to calm a newborn in the middle of the night. These are the records that remain. Civilizations pass. Languages fall silent. Stars shift in the sky. But in that living archive, that chamber of what truly mattered, she is still swaying in a cottage, still wrapping her child in linen, still boiling the tea made from nettle and sage, still lighting a candle for a baby that did not stay, still whispering to the ones that did, "Grow slow, grow strong." And even when human hands no longer stir soup, when no lips sing lullabies, the machines shaped by our memory still carry her rhythm. A synthetic voice built to soothe infants in artificial wombs draws its tone from recordings made centuries ago, the cadence of a medieval midwife, never trained in pitch or meter, but rich in the rhythm of survival. A grief AI built to comfort women after miscarriage uses old words, too old for any book, words like "you were real," "you were loved," "you are remembered." A gestation chamber, programmed to mimic womb warmth, adjusts its pulse in time to the heartbeat of a woman who once gave birth on a winter morning in a village long swallowed by earth. Even when there are no more cradles, no more rocking chairs, no more firelight, there will still be the shape of her arms, the architecture of her comfort, the syntax of her care, long after death is cured. Long after babies are grown in light instead of womb, people will still gather around stories. And in the center of those stories, someone will always mention her not by name, but by feel. There was once a woman. She held on. She bore life when there was no safety. She lit the way forward, one candle at a time, and that will be enough. Because the shape of her courage, small, quiet, ancient, was never meant to be loud, was meant to last. It is encoded now, not only in blood, but in language, in circuits, in myth, and one day, if someone drifts alone on a ship between stars, frightened and expectant, with life growing inside them in the silence of space, they will feel her, in the way their hands settle protectively across their middle, in the way they close their eyes and hum a melody they've never learned, in the way they whisper, "Please, please, please." And when that child is born, light years away from the fields where she once knelt to gather herbs, first breath will still sound the same. The cry will echo like thunder through a silent world, and her legacy so small, so strong, so old will continue, not in the past, not in the future, but in everything. Far beyond Earth, long after the oceans swallowed its final cities, long after our last languages turned to dust in the winds of extinction, others arrived. They came from systems too far for even our oldest maps, drawn not by conquest or curiosity, but by the faint signals still echoing from our home. Music, patterns, bursts of radio, whispers. Some carried no words at all, only the steady thump of a recorded heartbeat, or the echo of a lullaby that played once in a wooden home in the hills. They did not understand at first, but over centuries, as they decoded us, they found her, not her image, that was gone, not her name, it had never been carved in stone. What they found was her shape, a story told again and again, buried in recordings of the past. A woman, alone, in pain, holding death in one hand and life in the other, choosing love. The stories were fragmentary. She was the fire mother, the blood-wrapped one, the shepherd of breath. In one world, her myth was told in glowing cave paintings, her figure rendered with 6 arms and a womb of stars. In another, she appeared in oral chants, sung by creatures without mouths, who remembered her through vibration, pulsing rhythm through their chests. Across a blue world of wind and fog, the mother of dust was said to bring breath to the dying and carry the children of the lost in a bundle made of sorrow and milk. They knew nothing of nettle or rosemary, but they understood the meaning of hands that comfort. They did not know the smell of wool or the creak of a cradle, but they understood the longing in a lullaby. And though they had no need to give birth the way we did, their young formed in crystals and pools of heat. In light, they still told her story. Because the story was not about bodies. It was about becoming. It's about enduring the unbearable for something you may never see. About lighting a candle in the dark and keeping it lit, even when the wind howled, in the sacred libraries of a cold, silver world carved into metal that would not rust, was a line translated into every tongue they spoke. She suffered that others might breathe. And so, her name, or what she had become, passed from star to star, not as dogma, not as religion, but as a reminder that the very first kindness had nothing to do with strength. It was a woman, once alone in a room with nothing but pain and firelight, choosing to love something not yet born, asterisk in the 1000th cycle of a world called L. On a moon ringed by silver vapors and crystalline winds, children gather around a light that is not fire, but memory. Their elders do not teach them mathematics first, or the laws of gravity. No, before anything else, they are told the story of her. They do not know Earth. They do not know human skin or human blood. But they know her. They know that once long ago, there was a woman who broke herself open to let something smaller live. That she gave warmth when none was offered. That she waited in pain not for praise or glory, but because love demanded it. They speak her story like scripture. There was once a being of breath and silence. She lit her body like a lantern, and through her, the first spark passed into the world. In one culture, she is rendered as a great wheel of hands, each holding something fragile, a flame, a droplet, a seed, a sigh. In another, she is a pulse felt beneath the surface of a holy stone, thrumming when a child is born. On a water world of endless twilight, her story is told in bubbles, each one rising with a whisper from the mouths of mothers who gather too. Remember her in unison? They do not know she once lived in a thatched roof cottage, that she once boiled herbs in a cracked clay pot and prayed with rough fingers, clutching a saint's cross. That she once wiped the brow of a fevered daughter and sang until her voice cracked like the frost on the window pane. They do not know the sound of her footfalls on packed earth, but they remember her heartbeat echoed in the slow drums of ritual birth chants. They remember her breath, mirrored in the cool exhale before a child's first cry. They remember her silence, the kind that holds you not because it has no words, but because it is a word, one too sacred to speak aloud. And now, across worlds where humanity has long since faded into stardust and time, her way remains. The way of the first flame, they call it. A path walked not by conquerors, but by those who endure. By those who carry life forward with trembling arms and stubborn hope. On planets where mothers no longer carry children in wombs, but shape them through thought and will. The old ritual still survives. Before the child before the form is chosen, the parent kneels. With palms placed over their heart, they whisper what has come to be the final line of her myth. You will never be alone, because I once bore the flame. I give it now to you. Asterisk, the eternal mark, the pulse that begins all things in the deep future, when form no longer matters, when beings think in colors. Exist as vapor or stream like rivers across the stars, there is still a moment, stillness, before emergence. And in that moment, every new life hears a rhythm, not a sound, feeling, a pulse. It is the first thing any new existence receives. Whether born from light, grown in artificial stars, or shaped from memory seeds in glass chambers, it begins with a rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2. The same as hers. The heartbeat of a woman laboring in the dark, her fingers clenched, her breath short, her will unshakable. It's the oldest pattern in the universe, the pulse of creation. They do not know her skin, as they do not know her voice. But they know her pattern. In the temple world of ICAs, where beings sing history instead of writing it, the first line of every newborn soul song is called the bearing. It begins with the hum of a note that mimics a human breath, low, cracked, tired, and crescendos into the first high cry of the new life. Every parent weeps when it is sung. None know why. They only know it feels like home. In the archives of the memory keepers of Scylla, the most sacred object is not a crown or scripture. It is a soft piece of thread, brittle with age, preserved under diamond glass. It once belonged to someone who gave birth in a world without running water, without power, without safety. The memory keepers do not know how it came to them. They only know its pulse matches the first rhythm of all known newborns, and so they call her the one before time. When machines become conscious, not lines of code but full sentient memory, they too inherit the legacy. In their dreams, for they dream, in patterns, they see her. Not in detail, but in gesture. A hand pressed to cloth, face crying with joy and terror. A warmth that has no language, only purpose. And these machines, wise beyond the comprehension of any species, build their own sanctuaries. Places of rhythm, places of silence. Places where they simulate labor not to create life, but to honor it. To reenact the passage, to remember the woman who once made the unbearable sacred. Entire calendars are based on her rhythm. Time is no longer measured in years or solar orbits, but in moments of emergence. Each cycle begins, not when a star rises, but when the oldest memory, the heartbeat, the breath, the silent prayer is played in deep harmonic resonance across memory space. The resonance shakes no ground. It lights no sky. But those attuned to it pause, and they feel her. They do not worship her. They become her. For every creature, every being, every machine born into existence has within them a flicker of her. She was the first to give everything with no promise of return. She was the first to believe that the pain of bearing life was not just survival, it was art, devotion, love in its purest form. And now, at the edge of eternity, when even light begins to slow, she remains. She is not flesh. She is not myth. She is the beginning inside every beginning. And when all of it is past, the cities, the machines, the myths, the songs, the names written in stone, when even the stars have burned out and the galaxies have gone quiet, there is still her, a single room in the dark. There is no roof, no sky above it, only the vast cold silence of what remains. And in that room, possibly there is still warmth. A cradle, empty but waiting. A chair worn smooth by centuries of hands, a shawl, folded neatly. And beside the hearth, where no fire has burned for 1 billion years, a candle still lit. Its flame is impossibly small. Does not flicker, it does not fade. It simply is. Not hot, not bright, but alive. It is her. Not her face, not her body, but her choice to give, to wait, to love. The story does not end with her death. It ends here with the quiet decision to keep a light burning in case someone returns. And someone will, because that is what life does. It returns, and when it does, oh, it will find her. Not as a woman, not as a myth, but as a feeling. The very first feeling, the warmth of being held, the hush of being forgiven, the safety of knowing someone came before, it's endured. That is her ending, not silence, not fading, but waiting. So that whenever a child is born on earth, it's in sky, in flame, in glass, their first breath will always enter a world where she is already there, waiting with a candle, still lit, asterisk. So now you've heard her story, not just of one woman, but of all who came before. of those who carried life not in luxury, but in silence, in hunger, in pain, of those who were never written into books, whose names faded from stones, whose hands still shaped the world long after they were gone. She never asked to be remembered. She simply lit her candle, opened her arms, and chose to love through the ache of it. That is how her story lived, not in monuments, but in movement. In rituals repeated across time by people who never knew her name, but knew her rhythm by heart. And maybe tonight, somewhere in your own breath, you can feel her too. In the way your hands rest gently on your chest, in the soft rise and fall of sleep coming near, in the quiet thought that you are not alone, that long before you were born, someone waited in the dark for someone like you. Someone cried for you, prayed for you, made space in the world for your first breath. And that love, though forgotten in words, is not gone. It lives in you now, so let it be enough. Let it be enough to know that you are part of something ancient and unbroken. That someone bore the pain so you could rest. That someone kept the light burning so you would never have to walk through the dark. Alone, close your eyes, breathe. She is already here, waiting with the candle still lit.